As we start to think about this, the food chain has collapsed. We're now eating more chemical, or as much chemical as we are nutrient. What is the impact on the bacteria? We already mentioned that the soil was suffering, but it's interesting to think that there's an exact counterbalance in our own human ecosystem. Each species of bacteria is really engineered to address one little particular microenvironment of the nutrients. And so you think of something like selenium or molybdenum, these little tiny trace elements. They have to be processed through very specific bacterial pathways. Well, if those nutrients are no longer in the food, there's not a natural drive for there to be a large ecosystem. As the nutrients narrow and narrow and narrow down because our fertilizers have narrowed down their nutrients, therefore the soil has lost complexity, we are all turning into monoculture. We're monoculture in the fields with soy, corn, wheat growing. We're monocultures in the gut. And as we lose that bacterial diversity, we start to get very vulnerable to overgrowth of weed-like bacteria and fungi and candida, yeast-type elements, and we start to overgrow with these unbalanced systems. And so that collapses on one side of the equation. There's not enough drive for diversity by the food that we're eating. But at the simultaneous moment, back in 1945 again, we saw the debut of penicillin. It was found a few years earlier, but we're producing very small amounts and it was really reserved for the troops. World War II got over and suddenly penicillin became widely available. And it was the beginning of course, what has been a 60-year march towards more and more and more diversity in these antibiotic options for the doctors. So the doctors started dumping more and more antibiotic into the patients without regard or really understanding what we were doing back then. We were doing shots of penicillin in the butt for viruses, earaches. It just didn't matter. You got a shot of penicillin and called the doc in 2 days. What was happening, of course, is we were killing lots and lots of species that were vulnerable to these first antibiotics. And that, of course, led to overgrowth of others that were not being killed by the antibiotics. So we had to keep creating more and more antibiotics for these more and more drug-resistant bacterial strains. And of course now in this modern day, we have massive epidemics of hospital-acquired infections and surgery-acquired infections, etc. And so we've got this situation where we were killing with the antibiotics at the same time we were losing demand through the biodiversity of our food. The result is a desert.